This is the Retroid Pocket Mini, and today we're going to find out if it's the 4.3 compact OLED handheld that we've been waiting for. So there's nothing particularly special about what this comes with. We have our typical packaging. We've got the console, and we've got an included USB-C cable, and that's about it for that. In terms of accessories, I did order the case, which is pretty nice. It's not terrible. It's not completely molded, but it does have little spots for the bump outs here, and a nice little protective flap that covers it. There's a decent amount of space here if you want to put like a charging brick or micro SD cards, headphones, etc. in there. Some accessories that I didn't pick up are replacement face buttons, replacement buttons and triggers for the rest of the device, a full cutout screen protector, the dock and shell that kind of snaps on to the outside of that, as well as a charger. As far as the specs go, we're looking at the Snapdragon 865 system on a chip here with a glorious 1280 by 960 AMOLED screen at 3.7 inches in size, 6 gigabytes of RAM, Hall sticks, Wi-Fi 6, and I'll put that up on the screen now so you can see what else comes with the device. And you get all that for the price of $199, not including shipping, as well as there is a combo deal if you want to pre-order both the Retroid Pocket Mini and the Retroid Pocket 5 at the same time, which gets you a nice little discount. I think you're looking at $390 US-ish versus $420, so you're saving about $30 there. There aren't any other configurations available as far as performance or RAM. It's the standard 6 gigabytes of RAM, 128 gigabytes of storage on the device. There are a few different color schemes available. We've got the black, which is shown here, the Saturn colorway, the orange colorway, which looks like a white or gray-ish faceplate on it, the Super Famicom. Well, they call it the SFC colorway, but to me it looks more like just Famicom, the NES. And then we have the 16-bit, which is the Super Famicom or Super Nintendo style with the European Skittles colored buttons. Would be cool to see a North America purple button set for it, as for those of you like me who grew up with Super Nintendo, there's definitely some nostalgia there. So let's jump right into an overview of the device and take a look at what is here. Starting at the top and working our way around, we've got our bumper and trigger, exhaust for the fan, volume rocker, power button, the other bumper and trigger. On the bottom, we have the TF card slot here, headphone jack, and USB-C port. And unfortunately, as mentioned by some other reviewers, this TF card slot, the cover isn't fully flush here, so a bit of a fit and finish thing, but I mean, it stays in, it hasn't popped out or anything like that, but your finger definitely catches on it if you run it there. Looking at the front of the device, we've got the select and start up top. They are small little buttons. I do like the placement of them. They're a little bit small, they're a little bit clicky, but they get the job done for the most part. We've got our D-pad, our face buttons, our left and right analog Hall effect joysticks, a left and right front-facing speaker here, home button, which double taps you back to the home interface of Android, your launcher, and then a back button for Android here. And that's pretty much it as far as the inputs and outputs on the device. We've got, of course, the all glass front, which can get a little bit of smudgy like the good old PlayStation Vita here, but it's not terrible. It's not the worst I've seen, but definitely something to keep in mind. Probably more noticeable on the black unit than on others. And on the back, we have these little ergonomic grips, bumps on either side that you can kind of hold on to, though I don't always necessarily put my finger right in this valley. And we'll talk a little bit about that during the ergonomics section. And we've got the input for the fan here. The plastic is just okay. It's a little hollow feeling. It's a little bit on the cheaper side of feeling. I think that actually the plastic here on like this red watermelon Retroid Pocket 4 Pro has a nicer texture and feel to it and feels a little bit less hollow sounding, but I'm not saying that it's bad, it's just okay. And we'll talk about this more in the input section here in just a moment. The shoulders and triggers, again, are kind of just okay. The triggers are actually not too bad, though they do have a sort of short throw, I guess the limitation of the size of the device. And then the bumpers here are pretty clicky sounding and feeling, but they're usable. And one last thing, as you can see here, I had to very carefully position my studio lights today, as this is quite reflective. So if you're going to play in an environment with a single bright light source, you may want to be wary of that, though the screen does get pretty bright and helps combat any reflectivity. Not an issue in a dark room. In fact, this handheld is amazing to play in a dark room, but something to be aware of. So moving on to the controls, one of my favorite parts to take a look at here. Let's bring up the tester app and see what we've got. As I just mentioned, the bumpers, they're clicky. They're clicky. They're a little, well, like cheap is a strong word, but they're not the most polished bumpers I've ever used on a device. I think even the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, while still clicky, feels just a little bit more solid. So kind of a bummer to see a little bit of regression there, but you know, they work, they register input. It's not really an issue in terms of clicking them during gameplay. They're certainly tactile and accurate, but just something to think about. The triggers have a nice smooth range, and as you can see, they are registering the full range. Here using the right trigger, and here using the left trigger. No dead zone issues, no calibration issues. It's pretty smooth. You know, on something like a racing game, it might be a little tricky to get right where you want to just because of the shallower throw, but I do really appreciate that we get analog triggers here and not just digital ones, so they are certainly usable, and they're probably about appropriate for the size of the device. As I mentioned, the start and select here are in a pretty good location. They are kind of loud and clicky, but you know, not buttons that you're hitting a lot, so I don't think that that's a huge deal. And the function buttons here have the same type of feel as the start and select. Now, moving on to the face buttons. So yeah, unfortunately, I think the face buttons are maybe the worst part about the Retroid Pocket Mini. I'm not going to sugarcoat it here. Now, I'm not saying that that's a deal breaker for me or anyone else. It just depends on what's important to you in a device, but they are honkin' loud. Like, yeah, I'm exaggerating by doing this, but even just a normal button press, like maybe you're mashing in a game, playing God of War or something like that, it's pretty annoying. Your partner is going to be upset if they're trying to focus on something and they're on the couch next to you. So just something to think about. They are also pretty small, and they are, let me see if I can show this here. They're pretty squared off on the edges here, so they're not necessarily pleasant. If your finger's not quite hitting them and you're repeatedly hitting them, you know, added with the height, it can get a little bit of fatiguing. I was playing some Tony Hawk and pulling off lots of tricks with repetitive button mashing, and my finger did get a little bothered. I'm not going to say that it hurt or anything like that. It was just not, you know, maybe the most comfortable that I have ever had. In fact, I think that this is actually a regression from the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro buttons. They still make noise, but it's not nearly as obtrusive as the noise on the Mini. So yeah, that's unfortunately kind of one of my big marks against this, is if you are really wanting a silent device or nice rounded buttons. You know, let's take a look at the RG406V here. I think Anbernic does typically do a better job on their buttons. They may not do a better job on joysticks and analogs and that kind of thing, but for the buttons here, there's a little bit of rattle, but it's nowhere near what you hear on the Mini. And they're a little tall, but they do have a nice amount of roundedness, maybe a little bit too wiggly, but you know, just something to keep in mind. You know, or versus like a full-size controller, obviously having buttons this size would be silly, but just goes to show how small these ones are. So unfortunately, one of my negatives on the Retroid Pocket Mini. Now, of course, they are membrane buttons. They're still usable. They have accurate input. It's not actually an issue really in terms of playing the game and getting the inputs you want. It's more just an annoyance type thing. So something to keep in mind. Moving over to the D-pad, I think here is a stark contrast to the face buttons. This is excellent. It feels nice. It's a little smaller, but for the device size, it is appropriate. But it really has that tactile feel to it. As you can see here, I don't have any false diagonals, but if I want the diagonals, I can easily roll over to them, can easily roll around it. So no funny business with this D-pad. It is very tactile and accurate in its use. Moving on to the joysticks. These are the joysticks you may know and love from Retroid and AYN that are bigger, better range than a Switch joystick, and they are quite nice and accurate. I don't really have any cardinal snapping. You know, full-size joysticks are always fun to have, but wouldn't make sense on a device like this. So I think these are actually maybe the best size you could pick for this device. Another thing that I kind of like going on here is they are nicely recessed into the shell. So, you know, kind of hard to show, but it's the stick only protrudes just a little bit there. It's not sticking way outside of the device. You know, looking here on the the 406. These things are just like, woo, sticking way out. They could have recessed these with how chunky this is. So, you know, Anbernic, if you're watching, think about that on the next one. So yeah, nice little recess in there and makes them nice and easy to use. How do I feel about using these sticks during a game? Well, left stick only, yeah, totally fine. Not an issue. You can kind of hold it like this. As you can see, I grip it closer here and a little bit farther away here. I can support the way it's light, so it's not a big deal. Using both sticks, yeah, again, it's usable, but I really kind of have to just like balance this device here. Gripping it like that is super uncomfortable, and you're accidentally going to hit these buttons. So there's this. Now, one thing I will say about the fact that this joystick is recessed is at the top of its motion, I can accidentally hit the B button here depending on where I put my thumb. If I really like just put my tip right there, then it won't happen. But who really uses just the tip when they're using their joysticks? So usually it's kind of like the pad or the crook of your thumb, and then yeah, you can accidentally hit these buttons here. Maybe that's just a consequence of how close they are. Maybe it's a skill issue. It's something to be aware of. So moving straight into ergonomics, since we are already kind of talking about that here, yeah, this is comfortable for D-pad gaming. You can easily hold it. Your thumbs are placed exactly where you need them to be to use the face buttons and the D-pad, both triggers, both bumpers, and start and select. You can reach all of the primary controls that you're going to need for D-pad gaming without shifting your hands around. The story, again, does come a little different with the joystick. You're either going to have to pivot your hands out a little bit here. And you can do this, but I don't like putting my thumbs way back like this. This is just a recipe for thumb pain when you're playing. Probably don't recommend doing that. You just kind of hold it like this. When I'm in that situation, I was talking earlier about the bumps. I don't really, you know, for 16-bit, my hand is up here, caressing, cradling that little groove there. But for joystick gaming, I'm actually kind of resting these fingers on the bumps themselves and not up here, so that I can use the joysticks on the device. Now, the Retroid Pocket 5 is probably going to be a better fit for a joystick gaming device, as well as other devices out there. If you're going to be doing twin stick FPS 3D games, you know, maybe this isn't the right device. And also the screen's kind of small for that. So, okay, so taking a look at how this stacks up in terms of size, the PlayStation Vita is a great place to start, as there's definitely a lot in common between these two devices with that black and that gloss finish. And it's a bit taller. I don't know if you can really see that from that angle, mainly because of the ergonomic bumps, so to speak. But it is a little bit narrower in height wise. It's about the same. It's slightly less tall than the Vita is. So yeah, I mean, the Vita and this kind of similar in terms of where the placement of everything is and the ergonomic. Compared to another Retroid product here, we've got the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. As you can see, it's a little less thick in its design, but it is about same height, almost exactly the same height, but of course it's wider. You know, comfort-wise, I'd say it's kind of the same. They both have pretty good D-pad ability. In fact, these triggers are kind of weird of how much they pivot here versus the way they pivot here. Because they're smaller, they're actually more comfortable to use on the RP Mini, I think, than on the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. So something to think about. Don't really have any other horizontals at the moment to speak of, but you know, comparing it to the RG406V, you know, I guess I can turn the screen on so you can see that size difference really looks like in terms of the two devices. 3.7 inches, 4 inches. This does look quite a bit bigger, but the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro has more dense pixels, gets brighter, and of course it's OLED, so there are definitely some pros to this screen versus this one, though I'm still excited to see what kind of horizontals we might see out of Anbernic on the heels of that device. Actually, I do have one more horizontal, so I'll do a quick comparison with that, which is the Anbernic RG28XX. So you can see when you're thinking about mini, here's truly a mini device. Here is a device that's kind of mini just in name. Now, don't get me wrong, it's still compact. It's not that big, as you can see by the size of my hands. It's not like it is some enormous monstrosity of a device. It's not super pocketable in the sense that it's just going to slide right into your pocket. I would still put it in the case and toss it in my bag, but it won't take up a whole lot of room, so that is still nice. All right, so now for possibly the main reason, besides the processor, that you might have bought this device or be interested in buying this device, is the screen. Of course, it's OLED. It's bright. It's 1280 by 960, which is 432 pixels per inch, which if you have listened to my other videos, you know that when it comes to integer scaling, I sort of feel that once you're in that 400 or even higher 300s range, integer scaling doesn't really matter as much. You can use some filters to smooth out a little bit if you see any issues, but really you can kind of just set it and forget it and not worry about integer scaling. Now, of course, if you are hardcore on integer scaling, more PPI is still good because it means the step between each side is a little bit less, so you're not losing as much screen real estate when you turn that on. But given that this is only 3.7 inches, I would prefer to use the full display over integer scaling if it's a system that's not going to perfectly scale. In terms of the color accuracy and vibrance on here, let's just pull up Dead Cells, one of my favorite games to show off a screen since it is so vivid. And let me wipe off some of the smudges that are appearing here. So, you know, that is definitely a thing with this device. So as you can see, it is nicely saturated and looks great. There are actually two different display modes, and let me see if I can do, without moving the device, a toggle so you can see just what that difference is without changing anything. So we'll go into our settings and display, and then under advanced, you can pick colors, and then you have natural, boosted, and adaptive. So if you click on that boosted, you're gonna get a little bit more vibrancy than before. You probably can't tell just from looking at this footage now versus a few moments ago, but right now I'm gonna toggle back and forth so you can see the difference between the two. Personally, I think I do prefer the boosted colors overall. We're back on natural now, which is what I'll leave it on for the review, just for accuracy's sake. But when I'm playing on my own, I like the boosted colors because they are a little bit more vivid. Maybe they're not as perfectly accurate. With the OLED, it just pops. It's great. Is there any light bleed? Haha, no, just kidding, it's OLED, don't have light bleed. As far as motion clarity goes, I would give this screen a good rating. Haven't seen any issues, nothing like the Odin 2 or even the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro has a little bit of ghosting if you ask me. I think this is more clear. Let's see if we can actually get a side-by-side of what that looks like. Okay, so I don't know if you're gonna make this out at a 30 frames per second video on YouTube, but the motion clarity is a little bit better here on the Retroid Pocket Mini than it is on the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. I can, to my naked eye, see a little bit more trails and ghosting on this than I can on this one. Side note, the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro I've got at like 80% brightness, and the Retroid Pocket Mini at like 30% brightness, and this is like about the same brightness right now, so it just goes to show you how much brighter this gets, making it a great choice for outdoors and brighter environments. Bringing up the VSync texture, we are getting a solid 60 frames per second. We're not getting 59, we're not getting 61, we are truly getting a 60 frames per second. Overall, once in a while it'll cycle around and it will turn green as there are no excessive frame times. Every once in a while there's a spike, but you know, this is a browser-based screen tester, so I'm not going to put a whole lot of stake in how perfect the frame times on here, but what I can tell you is that it looks good and there are no issues with synchronization staying at 60 Hertz on here, so that is good news for the screen. All right, here is a gray screen checking for what is called Mira, or kind of a streaking or blotchiness to the OLED display. Can't really see anything on the camera feed here, and I don't think I can focus much closer. In terms of my naked eye, I say that maybe, just maybe, there's the faintest vertical streaking in the display. Again, I don't think it's going to show up on here. It's nothing like what you see on the RG556, just FYI there. So no, I would say that this is a good performance for an OLED screen, and I don't have any concerns there. All right, let's really quickly touch on audio. We've got speakers. They work. That's about all I have to say for this section. No, but seriously though, they're there, they produce audio. It's relatively clear. It does have a high mids, or low highs, if you will, spike that makes not really retro stuff sound harsh, but if you're listening to a game that has an actual like rock soundtrack or something like that, you're playing Burnout, then yeah, the music sounds a bit tinny and harsh to my ears. And of course, you see how big they are. There's no such thing as bass coming out of these. So overall, they serve the purpose of existing and providing audio for the games. And they're not terrible, but they are by far not the best speakers that I've ever heard on a handheld. Jumping into software on the device, we will take a look at what we have here. I'm just starting up an app so that I can summon the little bar that I need to take a look at the menu here. So along the top here, we have the key mapping hotkey, a guide for the key mapping, a button tester, and then profiles to switch between for the screen mapping, as well as a toggle to turn it on and off. We've got essentially a do not disturb mode toggle. We've got the speed up option, which what it does is clear out other apps and free up memory on the device. a live streaming that requires you to download some third-party app to stream, no thank you, a screenshot tool, screen recording tool, and then across the bottom you've got your FPS display, temperature, CPU usage, memory usage, and the brightness slider. Fun fact, you can tap on the FPS meter. Didn't realize this was a button until I did some Googling, and that brings up the on-screen FPS display when you're playing a game. You can see up top here that we are now showing the FPS over everything. I don't know that this is entirely accurate because there's times where I was testing emulators and the internal stats of the emulator did not match up with this, and I'm more inclined to believe the emulator than this overlay, but in a pinch for applications or emulators that don't have an overlay, such as Android apps, this is handy. On the top menu here, you have all of the standard options. Most notably, we've got a performance toggle here that toggles between a standard, performance, and high performance mode, and those also trigger the corresponding fan modes. Quiet is on when we're on performance, it's off when we're on the lowest mode, and it's on sport when we're on the high performance mode, which is pretty offensive. I'll show you that later. The controller style toggle between Xbox and Nintendo. L2, R2 mode, that's toggling whether it is analog or digital button, and then the rest of your usual stuff. And then we do have, where did it go? Yes, the joystick lights, which as you can see, I always just turn off, and other stuff is just standard Android things. Definitely turn on the dark theme for OLED in my opinion. So as far as heat goes while using the device, I can say that largely it's a non-issue. When I first received the device and I had it plugged in, charging, and I was doing all sorts of setup, yes, at that point it did get kind of hot. The back was pretty warm, especially around the fan intake here and along the top, and the screen across the top here was pretty warm with some hot spots here by the D-pad and the Y button. And I wouldn't say that it was painful or even really uncomfortable, but it was definitely noticeably hot in those areas. Again, that really only happened when I was maxing out the device by setting it up and charging at the same time. But if you play a lot while charging, something to keep in mind, you might have to deal with a little bit of heat there. During retro games, 16-bit, lower end stuff, not an issue, doesn't really get warm. For PS2 and GameCube, yeah, it can get a little bit warm in those aforementioned areas, but not even as uncomfortable as when I was charging it. Totally tolerable. You know, I could kind of feel a little bit along here and here and here for the heat, which brings me to the fan and the fan noise. So yeah, I don't think you really need to use the high performance mode or the fan on sport for almost anything that you're going to play on here up to PS2 and GameCube. So in that regard, it doesn't matter. Don't turn it on. It's not annoying. You're good. But if you do find yourself needing to turn on the sport fan for high performance gaming, you might annoy some people in the room. So let's take a listen. I'm just going to quickly move my mic. And for starters, let me turn standard performance mode. Okay, no fan. You might ask, why are you showing me this? I can't hear anything. Well, it's a baseline noise. The light that I use does have some fan noise coming out of it, so there's a sort of a bass level here. I've now turned on quiet mode, and you probably can't hear a difference. That's because quiet mode is nice and quiet. It almost feels like it's not doing anything, but hey, if it's helping, then go ahead and leave it on. Not annoying. But here's sport. The air rushing sound isn't what bothers me. It's that there's a bit of a high-pitched whine. Putting my phone in a couple spots to make sure that it picks that up. And here's me speaking at a normal volume with the fan on about the same distance from the mic, and so you can hear what that sounds like. And like I said, to be fair, I don't think I ever went past the performance mode. I never went into the max performance mode, or sorry, high performance mode. So fan noise wasn't really an issue with me as it just stayed in quiet mode. But if you're maybe trying to do Winlator or Unspeakable Nintendo emulators, then maybe you might need that higher fan speed and have to deal with that noise. Personally, I just wouldn't even bother with that kind of stuff on this device because it's kind of small anyways. All right, so I want to take a moment to talk about my experience gaming on the RP Mini. Android games are a pretty great way to enjoy this system. If you've got some controller-based Android games, pretty much this is going to run them. I think this processor is capable of all but maybe the most demanding graphics settings. I'd be surprised to find an Android game that didn't run on here unless you were really just trying to crank it. Dead Cells, always one of my favorite games to play, and it is a super vivid game on this OLED. Definitely a great match. I also went ahead and picked up Grid Autosport Legends to get a kind of full racing sim or arcade sim on a handheld at least. And it's a pretty enjoyable game to play here. As far as performance goes, I did have to use the medium graphics settings on this to maintain a solid 60 frames per second, and that's on the performance or the medium setting on the RP Mini. When I cranked this up to the maximum graphics, it did run, but I only got like 30 to 35 frames per second. So in this case, I'm preferring the 60 frames per second, and the game still looks excellent on this display. Moving over to emulation, I want to start with my system that is the one that I grew up playing the most, my childhood, the Super Nintendo, so definitely a very nostalgic thing for me, playing Mega Man and being just as bad as I was at it when I was a kid, but this game has some great colors and looks excellent on the screen, and I wanted to show off some shaders and how those work out with this device. So, talking about integer scaling, if you look at the health bar here, there's some very slight inconsistencies. So we're going to put on a anti-aliasing shader and see how that looks. CRT shaders are also a great way to leverage the OLED on here. I am using the CRT Geom shader, and as you can see, those corners just kind of melt into the OLED screen and the black device. Personally, definitely think getting black on this device is 100% the way to go. And since the screen gets so bright, we can compensate some of that brightness loss from the scan lines in the shaders with the brightness that the display has on tap. Another CRT shader here, CRT LOTS, another good one to use on this handheld. And thanks to Zoo's recent review, I have discovered CRT Consumer. Trying that one out here. This one definitely lowers the brightness a little bit more, but again, I had enough brightness on tap to compensate for that. A really underappreciated thing I think on a bright screen is the ability to use shaders like this, even when in a bright environment. Again, just to show how the bezels disappear, here is Game Boy Color. You can actually see that tiny white sliver on the right from the pull-out menu, but otherwise those pillar boxes on the sides are nearly invisible on the black unit. Again, I can't recommend the black unit enough just for the fact that it doesn't really look like there is any unused screen real estate. Now, there's definitely some novelty to having a mini PSP experience. I think the screen on this, though, ends up being even smaller than the screen on the PSP Go when you factor in the crop. Again, those top and bottom bars are mostly invisible other than that frames per second counter I have turned on there. And so, it's pretty good experience in terms of what it looks like, but it is pretty tiny, and some games are going to be near illegible at this size, so it might not be the premium pick for that, but it is pretty cool to be able to have the PSP catalog on tap for occasional play. Moving on up to the heavier hitters, here's God of War on PlayStation 2 using Nether SX, and I'm running this at 2.25x OpenGL, which is approximately the resolution or just a tiny bit more than the screen, and it plays without any issue at all. That is awesome to see. Gran Turismo 3 here largely ran at 3x, except there's a specific area of this one track with some God rays type effects, and it does slow down just a little bit. Honestly, it doesn't matter a whole lot whether you have it at 3x or 2x or maybe even 1x, you still get that tiny bit of slowdown. But overall, still a really great experience. I played a lot of the Gran Turismo games as a kid, so it kind of blows my mind that I can play these in this tiny pocketable little device. It is really quite the nostalgia trip. Switching over to GameCube, another console I had in high school, so I have a lot of fondness for it. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 runs at 3x absolutely flawlessly, didn't encounter a single slowdown playing this game. This is one that is really quite smooth and super awesome on this device. Other than the loud buttons clacking when I am pulling off tricks, this is like a 10 out of 10 pocket GameCube experience. And finally, I did find sort of an Achilles heel of the device, F-Zero GX. Again, this is a game that's always hard to run. Starts off with a slowdown at the beginning here, and this is at 2x. And then largely it actually runs at 100%, except when you hit boost or certain effects happen on the screen, then it can slow down to about 70 or 80%. I messed around with Vulkan, OpenGL, 1x, 2x, 3x. Honestly, none of them really seemed to have a huge impact on those slowdowns, and 2x was the best compromise of still looking pretty good with just occasional slowdowns. So the game is still playable, but unfortunately does suffer from a little bit of a performance penalty occasionally. So to wrap up my thoughts on this device, I think that it is important in that we have not yet seen a small 4.3 device with this level of performance capable of playing a really good chunk of PS2 and GameCube library, and we're not wasting pillar boxing by having a larger 16:9 device to play them. Compared to the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, yes, the screen size is going to be a little bit smaller, but For 4.3 content, it's not going to be a huge difference. In fact, let's even pull up a couple 4.3 games just so you can see what we're talking about here. And just to give you a point of reference on that size, I'm holding up the Retroid Pocket 4, so they're perfectly on the same plane. You can see here that for 4.3, the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro is actually only just a hair bigger, and this performs consistently a little bit better across the board than the MediaTek chipset in here for PS2 and GameCube emulation. So if you're mainly going to play 4.3 systems, I would take this better OLED screen and smaller device 9 times out of 10 over the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. The only time I would take this is if I was going to play maybe some PSP or more 16:9 systems. So wrap it up, let's talk about pros, cons, and alternatives. Screen, 10 out of 10 for this size. It's OLED, it's clear, it's bright, it looks awesome. The only knock I could have against it is that if I wanted a bigger screen or a screen that was better for 16:9 content, which isn't really a shortcoming, it's just a design choice. The D-pad is excellent, tactile, love it. And overall, the rest of the controls are usable. Pretty nice triggers, pretty nice joysticks. The ergo, the form, yeah, it's pretty comfortable to hold for D-pad gaming, which is what I would intend to play on this, and some left stick games would also be totally playable. First-person shooters, yeah, maybe there's other better devices out there. In terms of cons, it's these dang face buttons. They're annoying. I was annoying myself, not even my wife, when I was playing on the couch last night. It was just clack, 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 clack as I was playing the game. So yeah, that's a bit of a bummer. Trigger throw is a little short. I don't even know if this deserves to be in the cons. It's just maybe a factor of the device. And the plastic is just, you know, okay feeling, maybe a little smudgy. It gets the job done. But I really don't have other strong cons besides those buttons. So it's just unfortunate that that is kind of the one thing that holds it back. Speakers aren't really great either, so I guess I can add that to the list. They are serviceable, and at least you get a headphone jack. Ioneo, are you listening? As far as the alternatives go, well, in kind of a similar-ish performance wheelhouse, if you want to go vertical, the RG406V is certainly an option. It still has a pretty vivid screen on it, even though it is IPS. Of course, you aren't going to get those black levels like you do on the OLED screen, but you do get the advantage of the larger size and better buttons. The D-pad on this is no slouch. So if vertical is your jam and you don't mind the ergonomics and looks of this, and you really prioritize having that slightly bigger screen, then the 406V is an option. You aren't going to get quite the same level of performance across the board though for PS2 and GameCube. This can play some stuff at 2x. There's going to be a lot more titles that you have to drop down to 1x on the T820 chipset compared to the Snapdragon in here. Another relevant comparison is the outgoing Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, which has actually seen some discounts now that the 5 has been announced. The screen is about the same size for 4.3 content, so for 4.3 only, I would still pick this, especially if they're a similar price. But if you want to play PSP as well, maybe some light Nintendo emulation that I totally wouldn't do, definitely wouldn't do that, Nintendo, if you're watching, or other 16:9 systems, maybe some native Android games or game streaming, then yeah, the 16:9 display here is better. I think the Retroid Pocket 5 coming though is probably going to invalidate the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, for me at least. I think it will be a little bit bigger. We'll show that off when that comes, but man, you're going to get that OLED display as well as the Snapdragon stability when it comes to game performance. So this is probably going to be a harder sell soon. If you already have one though, and you don't absolutely need the OLED, no, I don't think I would necessarily sell this and buy this if you like your Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. You're getting about the same size for 4.3 content. I don't have one here. There is the Anbernic Cube, which is going to give you the same performance as this chunky boy here, but in a horizontal format with analog triggers. So that's probably actually a better comparison. I just unfortunately don't have one of those on hand. So everything that I said here about the 406V mostly applies, except since it's a 1:1 screen, I don't think you actually gain much screen real estate on the Cube versus the Mini. So in that case, it's like, would you pay $40 more for OLED, or would you prefer the slightly better buttons of the Cube? I don't know. I think I'd still probably take the Mini in that battle. I think that's a wrap. The Retroid Pocket 4 Pro is the best 4.3 small OLED high performance handheld. And I kind of say that because it's the only one that really checks off all these boxes without too much compromise, other than loud buttons. Thanks for watching, and happy gaming.